The gates of Nineveh stood tall, their walls streaked with the blood of fallen enemies. Along the roads, severed heads lined the path, a silent warning to those who dared to challenge the empire. Inside the palace, the air was thick with the scent of oil and iron. A man knelt before the throne, trembling, once a leader, now a prisoner. Ashurbanipal watched in silence. He did not speak. He did not need to. A simple nod, and his guards stepped forward. The man's body convulsed as his skin was peeled from his flesh, his screams swallowed by the stone walls of the throne room. When it was over, his remains were cast outside the city, left to rot as a message to all who defied Assyria. This was not just a king. This was the ruler of the most feared empire on earth. His name spread across nations like a curse. To his people, he was a god. To his enemies, he was worse than death itself. Ashurbanipal ruled with an iron fist, forging an empire built on conquest and fear. He did not just defeat his enemies, he erased them. But was he a brilliant strategist who understood power, or a ruler consumed by brutality? Assyria was the most feared empire of its time. It didn't just conquer nations, it annihilated them. Resistance wasn't crushed. It was made into an example. Cities that defied the empire were turned into fields of corpses, their people executed or enslaved, their leaders flayed and impaled. The Assyrians ruled through terror, and it worked. No empire dared challenge them for long. This was the world Ashurbanipal was born into, a world where power belonged to those willing to use it without hesitation. He wasn't the first Assyrian king to embrace brutality. Those who came before him, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, had already set the stage. Each one pushed the limits of warfare, introducing new ways to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. But none of them would take it as far as Ashurbanipal. Most future kings spent their youth training in combat, learning the art of war. They studied swordplay, chariot warfare, and battle formations. Ashurbanipal? He spent his childhood learning how to think like an enemy before crushing them. He was a prince, but not the heir. His older brother, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, was the one destined to rule Babylon. Ashurbanipal was an afterthought, a backup. But his father, Esarhaddon, had other plans. Instead of sending him to military training, Ashurbanipal was placed under the guidance of the most brilliant scholars and spies of the empire. He learned to read and write Akkadian, Sumerian, and even the complex astronomical texts of the Babylonians, a rare skill, even among royalty. He wasn't just absorbing history, he was learning how to manipulate it. While his brother prepared for the throne of Babylon, Ashurbanipal prepared for something greater. He studied psychological warfare, espionage, and political deception. He learned how to control people without lifting a sword, and when to strike so no one ever dared strike back. This was not the upbringing of a mere prince. This was the education of a ruler who would dominate not just through strength, but through sheer calculation. Everything changed with a single decision. Their father, Esarhaddon, had ruled over Assyria with both brilliance and brutality. But when it came time to choose a successor, he did the unthinkable. He passed over his firstborn and named Ashurbanipal as the heir to Assyria. It was an insult that Shamash-Shum-Ukin would never forgive. Esarhaddon tried to avoid a civil war by making a compromise. Shamash-Shum-Ukin would still get Babylon, while Ashurbanipal would rule from Nineveh. On paper, they were supposed to rule as allies. But in reality, Babylon and Assyria had always been rivals. Giving each brother a throne only ensured one thing: war was inevitable. The moment Esarhaddon died in 669 BCE, the empire became a ticking time bomb. Ashurbanipal was now king, but his rule was far from secure. His enemies watched from the shadows, waiting for weakness. His brother, burning with resentment, began gathering support. The stage was set. But before Ashurbanipal could deal with the threat brewing in Babylon, he had other enemies to crush first. Assyria was powerful, but power meant constant rebellion. The moment a king showed weakness, the vultures began circling. Ashurbanipal moved fast, striking before his enemies could even organize. His first target? Egypt. Egypt had been a problem for Assyria for years, constantly resisting foreign rule. Under his father, the great city of Memphis had fallen to the Assyrians, but the Egyptians were notoriously difficult to control. The moment Esarhaddon died, they rebelled again. Ashurbanipal sent his most feared generals to handle the problem. They didn't just put down the rebellion, they made an example out of it. Cities were burned. Leaders were executed in public squares. Those who survived were paraded through the streets of Nineveh in shackles. Egypt was once again under Assyrian control, and its rulers were handpicked by Ashurbanipal himself. But this was only the beginning. Across the empire, smaller rebellions erupted, each one met with swift, merciless punishment. Ashurbanipal's forces moved like a storm, leaving behind a trail of death and submission. The message was clear: defy Nineveh, and you die screaming. But while Ashurbanipal was securing his empire, his greatest enemy was already moving against him. For nearly 2 decades, Shamash-Shum-Ukin played the role of a loyal vassal king. He sent tribute. He followed orders. But inside his palace walls, he was plotting something far more dangerous. By 652 BCE, his patience ran out. He declared war on his own brother. Shamash-Shum-Ukin was no fool. He knew Babylon alone couldn't defeat Assyria. So he began gathering all of Ashurbanipal's enemies, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, the Arameans, and the Elamites, all united under one cause: the destruction of Assyria. It was the most dangerous rebellion Ashurbanipal had ever faced. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, had turned against him. And worse, the revolt spread beyond the city walls, engulfing entire regions in open rebellion. But Ashurbanipal was not a man who panicked. He was calculating, ruthless, and patient. He didn't march straight into battle. Instead, he chose a slower, deadlier approach: a siege. For 4 years, he starved the city of Babylon into submission. There were no battles, no grand confrontations. Just silence, broken only by the wails of the starving. Supplies ran out. Disease spread. Babylon, once a thriving metropolis, became a graveyard. By 648 BCE, the city had collapsed. And Shamash-Shum-Ukin? He was nowhere to be found. Some say he set fire to his own palace, choosing to die in flames rather than face his brother's wrath. Others claim he was dragged from the wreckage and executed. Either way, Babylon was no longer a threat. But Ashurbanipal wasn't done. Survival was not enough, he needed to make an example. When Ashurbanipal's army entered Babylon, there was no resistance left. The streets were littered with rotting corpses. Those who had survived the siege were too weak to fight. But Ashurbanipal did not forgive. He poured fire into the temples of the gods, a direct insult to Babylonian culture and religion. The city's leaders were dragged from their hiding places, tied in chains, and sent marching to Nineveh. When they arrived, Ashurbanipal paraded them through the city like trophies, forcing them to kneel before his throne. Some were executed. Others were kept alive, reminders of what happened to those who challenged Assyria. Babylon, once the greatest city in Mesopotamia, had been humiliated, starved, and broken. And yet, Ashurbanipal's thirst for destruction wasn't satisfied. His brother's rebellion had been backed by Elam, an ancient kingdom to the east. And Elam was next. Ashurbanipal had crushed his brother's rebellion, but his thirst for destruction wasn't over. His next target? The kingdom of Elam, an enemy he would erase from history itself. Elam had made a fatal mistake. For centuries, the Elamites had been a thorn in Assyria's side, a powerful civilization in what is now modern-day Iran, known for its warrior kings and strategic alliances. They had survived countless Assyrian invasions, always managing to rebuild, always coming back stronger. But supporting Shamash-Shum-Ukin's rebellion against Ashurbanipal? That was a mistake they wouldn't come back from. To Ashurbanipal, this wasn't just another enemy. This was personal. Elam had interfered in Assyrian affairs, And for that, they had to be erased. Not conquered. Not occupied. Wiped from existence. His army prepared for war, not a campaign, not a conquest, but a massacre. Ashurbanipal's forces marched east, crossing into Elamite territory with one goal: total annihilation. He didn't negotiate. He didn't offer surrender. He didn't want prisoners. His army tore through Elam's cities like a storm. They looted temples, burned homes, and slaughtered thousands. Nobles were dragged from their palaces, executed in public, their bodies left to rot in the streets. Women and children were enslaved, their names erased from history. And then came the final blow, the destruction of Susa, Elam's greatest city. Susa was more than just a city. It was the heart of Elamite culture, its religious center, and its most sacred ground. It had stood for over 1,000 years, untouched by any foreign power. But Ashurbanipal was determined to reduce it to nothing. His army razed it to the ground. Not a single structure was left standing. The temples were burned, their gods dragged from their altars and destroyed. The sacred statues, symbols of Elam's divine protection, were seized and taken to Nineveh as trophies. But Ashurbanipal wasn't finished. He didn't just destroy buildings. He destroyed Elam's very identity. He ordered the archives of Susa burned, eliminating centuries of Elamite history. Their laws, their kings, their achievements, all erased. It was as if they had never existed. Then, to ensure nothing would grow there again, his men salted the earth. Fields that once fed thousands were turned to wastelands. The rivers that once sustained Susa's people were diverted, leaving the city to wither under the sun. Elam wasn't just defeated. It was gone. Ashurbanipal wanted the world to know what he had done. He ordered his scribes to carve his words into stone, ensuring that his revenge would be remembered for eternity. I scattered the people of Elam like mice. I took their gods and trampled them beneath my feet. I destroyed their cities so thoroughly that birds would not perch where they once stood. This wasn't war. This wasn't conquest, this was genocide. Elam had been one of the great powers of Mesopotamia, a civilization that had rivaled Assyria for centuries. But after Ashurbanipal, it ceased to exist. No more kings. No more armies. No more Elam. Elam was no more. But was Ashurbanipal's legacy one of greatness, or one of madness? Ashurbanipal didn't just inherit an empire. He perfected the science of terror. For centuries, Assyria had relied on sheer force to dominate its enemies, but Ashurbanipal took it to a new level. War wasn't just about conquest anymore, it was about breaking the will of an entire civilization before a single battle had even begun. If you fought against Assyria, you weren't just defeated. You were erased. The Assyrian army was not just large, it was unstoppable. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about technology, organization, and brutality on a scale no one had ever seen before. Cities that once stood for centuries fell in days under the weight of Assyria's siege engines. Massive battering rams were designed to shatter reinforced gates. Mobile towers, covered in wet hides to resist fire, allowed archers to rain down death from above. Engineers would reroute entire rivers, flooding enemy strongholds until they crumbled into the mud. The Assyrians didn't march blindly into enemy territory. They built supply chains as they advanced. Wells were dug along invasion routes to ensure soldiers never ran out of water. Arsenals were placed in conquered cities, turning them into launching points for further conquest. This meant Assyrian armies could fight for years without returning home, wearing down enemies who couldn't keep up. No army in the world could match them. Not in power. Not in endurance. And certainly not in ruthlessness. For Ashurbanipal, war wasn't just about winning. It was about making a statement so horrifying that future enemies would surrender before a war even began. After every battle, captured soldiers were skinned alive, impaled, or burned publicly. The remains were left outside city walls, a warning to anyone who considered resistance. Enemy kings were forced to wear their dead ancestors' heads around their necks before being executed. Assyrian soldiers were rewarded for bringing back enemy heads, the more, the better. Some carried them on their belts. Others piled them into pyramids outside conquered cities. It wasn't just about humiliation. It was psychological warfare. Sending messages in the worst way possible. Before attacking a city, Ashurbanipal often sent baskets filled with severed heads ahead of his army. It was a simple message: "You're next." Entire towns surrendered without a fight, knowing what would happen if they resisted. This wasn't war as it had been known before. This was a performance of fear, designed to linger in the minds of every neighboring kingdom. But conquering a city was easy. Keeping it under control was harder. But Ashurbanipal knew how to make sure no one dared rise against him again. When Ashurbanipal conquered a rebellious city, he often didn't kill everyone. He relocated them. Entire populations were forced into exile, transported hundreds of miles away. This destroyed their cultural identity and ensured they never rebuilt what was lost. The rulers of vassal states were forced to send their children to Nineveh. These royal hostages were educated in Assyrian ways, or executed if their fathers disobeyed. This meant kings who even thought about rebellion knew their families would pay the price. Fear didn't just maintain control. It prevented resistance before it even started. Ashurbanipal didn't just rule Assyria, he ruled fear itself. And no one knew it better than his enemies. But power wasn't just won on the battlefield. It had to be defended every single day. Ashurbanipal may have ruled over the most powerful empire of his time, but even he knew that the greatest threats weren't always foreign armies. They could be found in his own palace, sitting across from him at the dinner table. Every Assyrian king understood one thing: betrayal didn't come from enemies, it came from friends. And Ashurbanipal? He never forgot that. Nineveh was not just a capital, it was a fortress of paranoia. No one was safe, not even those closest to the king. Nobles and officials were regularly summoned to Nineveh for evaluations. If they were found to be plotting, they never returned home. Even those who were loyal had no guarantees. Disobedience, real or imagined, was a death sentence. Ashurbanipal had an extensive intelligence network, with spies planted in every province. Even his highest-ranking officials were being watched at all times. Messengers carried coded reports on who was whispering, who was conspiring, and who needed to disappear. Some nobles who had served him for years were executed without explanation. Others, who had once rebelled against him, were given wealth and titles, until they outlived their usefulness. No one knew where they stood, which made them too afraid to act against him. This wasn't just paranoia. It was strategy. By keeping his court in a state of constant uncertainty, Ashurbanipal ensured that no one felt safe enough to challenge him. Loyalty in Assyria was like a thin thread: one wrong move, and it snapped. Some of the most powerful men in Assyria simply vanished overnight. Advisors who once stood by Ashurbanipal's side were quietly removed, their families stripped of wealth and status. If anyone asked what had happened to them, they were next. Generals who failed on the battlefield were not just removed, they were destroyed. Some were paraded through Nineveh in chains, stripped of their titles before the entire city. Others were executed in front of their own men, a warning to anyone else who considered failure an option. Also, instead of giving absolute power to any one noble, he kept them divided. He created rival factions, pitting governors, military leaders, and advisors against each other. As long as they were too busy fighting among themselves, they had no time to turn against him. This system worked for a while. But paranoia is a dangerous thing. The more powerful he became, the more enemies he believed he had. And in time, even his own family was not beyond suspicion. Ashurbanipal was a man of contradictions. He ruled through fear, slaughtering entire civilizations, yet he spent his nights studying texts that few could even understand. He was a man of war, yet he dedicated his life to preserving knowledge. He executed scribes for the slightest mistakes, yet he left behind the greatest library of the ancient world. He didn't just want to be remembered as a conqueror. He wanted to be remembered as a god of wisdom and war. Long before his reign, Assyrian kings valued power over intellect. They built fortresses, not libraries. They collected territory, not knowledge. But Ashurbanipal was different. He ordered his men to search every corner of the empire for texts, scrolls, tablets, religious scriptures, medical records, astronomical calculations, military strategies. Anything of value, he took. The result? Over 30,000 clay tablets, meticulously archived in what became known as the Library of Ashurbanipal. It contained everything from agricultural techniques to omens and curses. Some of these texts had existed for over 1,000 years, and without Ashurbanipal, they might have been lost forever. But there was one text in particular that stood out. Among the tablets was a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known story ever written. A tale about a king seeking immortality, only to learn that even the most powerful rulers are destined to die. Ashurbanipal had the story copied and stored in his library, almost as if he saw himself in it. He had conquered cities, erased entire civilizations, and built an empire greater than any before it. But even he could not escape the fate of all men. And he knew it. That's why his records were different from those of other kings. They didn't just list victories. They glorified his personal cruelty. He wanted history to remember not just his conquests, but how he ruled through fear, how he made kings kneel before him, how he turned entire nations into ruins. In one inscription, he boasted, "I am Ashurbanipal, great king, mighty king, king of the universe. I have inflicted unrelenting terror upon those who opposed me. I have ripped out the tongues of those who spoke against me and fed their flesh to the dogs. I am the king who has no equal." Even in his intellectual pursuits, there was darkness. His library was not just a collection of knowledge. It was a monument to his own brutality. He saw himself as both a god of war and a god of wisdom. But the gods he worshipped would not protect him from his greatest enemy, time itself. For decades, Ashurbanipal had ruled with unquestioned authority. He had crushed rebellions, burned cities to the ground, and erased entire civilizations. He was feared across the ancient world, and for a time, it seemed as if Assyria would remain unstoppable. But no empire lasts forever. Not even the strongest. Ashurbanipal had spent years expanding Assyria's power, but the empire was rotting from the inside. His campaigns had drained resources. The once unstoppable Assyrian military was stretched thin, constantly fighting to maintain control over its vast territories. Cities that had been crushed rose in defiance once more. Enemies that had been scattered gathered their strength. Babylon, a city he had starved into submission, never forgot what he had done. The Medes, a fierce tribal force from the Iranian plateau, had been watching Assyria closely. And the Scythians, ruthless warriors from the north, saw an opportunity to strike. One by one, the cracks in the empire widened. As rebellions broke out across Assyria, its enemies began circling like wolves. For decades, they had lived in fear. But now, they wanted revenge. And Ashurbanipal? He was nowhere to be found. There is no clear record of how Ashurbanipal died. His reign ended in 631 BCE, but historians are left with questions. Did he die peacefully in his palace, ruling until his final breath, or was he assassinated, betrayed by those closest to him? Did the stress of endless war and paranoia take its toll, leaving him weak and broken in his final days? No inscriptions detail his last moments. No records celebrate his passing. It was as if the great king, the self-proclaimed ruler of the universe, had simply vanished from history. But what is certain is this: after his death, Assyria crumbled, his successors were weak. They failed to hold the empire together. The enemies that Ashurbanipal had crushed under his heel rose up stronger than ever. And in less than 2 decades, the empire that had ruled the ancient world was gone, because in 612 BCE, Babylon, the Medes, and the Scythians joined forces. The 3 greatest enemies of Assyria, once divided, now had one common goal. They marched on the city, the very heart of the empire Ashurbanipal had ruled. The Assyrians fought, but they were outnumbered, outmatched, and abandoned by their allies. Nineveh, once impenetrable, was breached. The Babylonians and Medes set fire to the city, tearing down palaces, slaughtering anyone who remained. The mighty capital that Ashurbanipal had once ruled with an iron fist was burned to the ground. The library of Ashurbanipal, his greatest achievement, was buried beneath the ruins. The empire that had once terrified the world was nothing more than ashes. Ashurbanipal had spent his life ensuring that Assyria would be feared for generations. But in the end, his brutality didn't make his empire stronger. It made the world hate him. For centuries, Ashurbanipal was forgotten. His empire had collapsed, his name buried beneath the sands of time. Unlike Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, he was not remembered in stories of heroism or military genius. His reign ended in fire, and history left him behind. But history doesn't stay buried forever. In the 19th century, archaeologists uncovered something remarkable, proof that Ashurbanipal had left behind more than just a legacy of war. He had left behind one of the greatest collections of knowledge the ancient world had ever seen. In 1853, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard led an expedition into the ruins of Nineveh, the city that had once been the center of Ashurbanipal's empire. What they found changed history. Hidden beneath the rubble, buried under centuries of destruction, was Ashurbanipal's personal library, over 30,000 clay tablets. It contained the first known copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest recorded literary work in human history. The tablets documented medicine, astronomy, law, military tactics, and religious rituals, a window into the mind of a king who had ruled both through knowledge and terror. This discovery rewrote our understanding of Mesopotamian civilization, proving that long before the Greeks or Romans, the Assyrians had been collecting and preserving knowledge on a massive scale. Ashurbanipal had once declared, "I have read the writings of all the scribes." Now, over 2,500 years later, the world could finally read his. Did Ashurbanipal influence future empires? His brutal tactics, psychological warfare, and military innovations didn't die with him. They were adopted, modified, and used by future conquerors across the world. The Persians, who would go on to build the largest empire of the ancient world, borrowed heavily from Assyrian administration and warfare. The Romans, known for their discipline and military engineering, followed strategies first pioneered by the Assyrians, including siege warfare and the use of roads to maintain control over vast territories. Even in the modern era, Ashurbanipal's use of terror to subdue entire populations can be seen in the tactics of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire, and even psychological operations used in World War II. He may have died over 2,500 years ago, but his methods of war, governance, and intimidation never truly disappeared. After Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, Ashurbanipal's dynasty was wiped out. His sons and successors couldn't hold the empire together, and within a few years, the once great Assyrian Empire ceased to exist. But what happened to the Assyrians themselves? Some historians believe that surviving Assyrian nobles and soldiers fled east, blending into Persian society. Others suggest that the Assyrian people never vanished, but instead became absorbed into the cultures of Mesopotamia, influencing later civilizations in ways that are still felt today. To this day, Assyrian communities still exist in parts of Iraq, Syria, and Iran, keeping fragments of their ancient heritage alive. Ashurbanipal had spent his life trying to ensure his name would never be forgotten. He saw himself as a god of war and wisdom, or ruler whose conquests would be remembered for eternity. But even he could not escape the fate of all kings. His empire fell. His name vanished from memory. And for centuries, all that remained of Assyria was dust and ruins. But history has a way of resurrecting the past. Ashurbanipal believed he was immortal through conquest. But in the end, the sands of time buried his empire just like they buried Nineveh. Ashurbanipal wanted his name to live forever, and in many ways, it did, but not how he imagined. Was he a brilliant ruler or a ruthless tyrant? Let's continue the conversation in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most feared rulers, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more gripping historical stories. The past is full of forgotten rulers, lost empires, and hidden truths, so stick around, because we're just getting started.